everyone, and this is Jason Williams. Welcome to Black Literature, Black History. And tonight we're going to continue with the book, The Big C, Langston Hughes' first autobiography. Now, at this point of the book, he's leaving Mexico. He convinced his father to send him to Columbia University in New York because New York is a place where Langston Hughes wanted to be. He wanted to see Harlem. He wanted to live in Harlem. You know, that's where he wanted to be. He convinced his father to send him there. So Langston Hughes makes his way to New York and Columbia University, and he makes his way to Harlem. Now, while attending Columbia University, he is face to face with the color line in the United States. And he doesn't deal well with the color line, having returned back from Mexico, so he does not succeed at Columbia University. His mother came to live with him for a while in New York and before returning back to Cleveland. And Langston Hughes wrote his father to tell him that he was dropping out of school and that his father need not send him any more tuition money, which his father abruptly stopped sending him money, and Langston Hughes decided to find work in New York. So while looking for work in New York, he realized how white supremacy works. In this story, in this book, he says, this was in the 1920s, there was no depression, there was work everywhere. However, he found it very difficult to find work in New York. And while he was looking for work, he found out that the newspaper ads asking for work were for white folks. And the only jobs that you could get as a black man or black person looking for work in New York were jobs that specifically stated that they were looking for colored workers. Now, eventually, Langston Hughes did find some odd jobs. He found some hard working jobs. He found a job working with some Greeks and doing field work. And he appreciated this job. And you'll find out that while reading through this autobiography that Langston Hughes really liked to do work where he had to use his hands and actual layman's work. He did at one time find work in an office, working with papers and contracts and things like that, papers, and he didn't enjoy that work. He liked to be a dishwasher. He liked to work out in the fields. He liked to use his hand. He liked to be with the regular people. But at this point, so he's in New York. He's struggling with work, job to job. So he decides, he does state that his father was right. He said, you know, during this experience, this life experience, he said his father was right. If a black man wanted to make it in this world, he should leave America. So what does Langston Hughes do? He finds a job in the shipyard so he can travel and actually leave America. Now, since he wasn't very knowledgeable about shipyards, the first job that he got was on World War II or World War I ships, and these ships weren't going anywhere. So he had jobs on these ships, just cleaning these ships, keeping them well oiled, and keeping them running. But they were not ships that traveled to other countries, which is what Langston Hughes wanted to do. So he finally found work on a ship called the SS Malone. And then at this point of the story of the autobiography, we come full circle. So we started out with a chapter called Sandy Hook, where he threw all of his books overboard and he was on a ship bound to Africa. And then when he got to Africa, he talked about not being black in people from Africa's eyes. He's not black. And then he went back to his childhood and he went back to his family history. Now, when I started this page this evening, I wanted to talk about what Langston Hughes is covering as he talks about his life. And he's actually talking about white supremacy. That's what he's talking about. That's what he's demonstrating in this autobiography and in his stories. In his stories, The Ways of White Folks, he talks about experiences that he had in story form in that book. And in this autobiography, he still, as I stated about The Ways of White Folks, Langston Hughes has a technique of writing where he wants people to buy his book, and the majority of people who buy books during this time period were white people. So he keeps it, he kind of hides in his text what he's talking about, but he's always addressing the color line, the race line. He doesn't get too emotional, but he's still demonstrating white supremacy. Like, he talks about his history and his ancestors being in the John Brown raid. He talks about living in Chicago. He talks about it being the summer before the Chicago race riots. You know, he talks about unions. He talks about his mother struggling to find work. He talks about his stepfather finding jobs here, finding jobs there. And he talks about his father's perspectives on living in the U.S. and trying to make it in the U.S. versus leaving the U.S. and trying to make it outside the U.S. And his father is very clear that he is against living in the U.S. and facing the color line. And I find it very interesting that Langston Hughes talks about how he hates his father. However, he never disrespects his father. And he actually, when he left Mexico the first time, he returned to Mexico. And his father taught him how to shoot straight, how to ride and shoot straight and survive in Mexico should he be attacked by bandits. And that's very interesting. So Langston Hughes knows how to carry a firearm and shoot it. If he knows how to shoot while riding a horse to escape bandits, you better believe he knows how to shoot walking the streets of New York. So even though we're talking about a poet who he seems very cool, calm, and collective in his writings, he knows how to protect himself, and he's walking around without fear. So he finds a job on a boat setting sail for Africa. So now we're full circle, and I want to read to you parts about this because at this point of the book, his story takes a change. His way of talking changes. So, on page 101, first chapter in book 2, Big C, you can see that there, Big C, and then page 101 is called Africa. And I start reading here. And I wanted to explain it, but he explains the way that he sees Africa and his political views very clear. Now, the beginning of this chapter is very descriptive, very poetic prose. But I'm going to skip some of that, and I'm going to start reading here. Okay. The crossing was bright and sunny. We reached the Azores, the Canaries, and finally Africa. A long sandy coastline gleaming in the sun. Palm trees, sky tall. Rivers darkening the sea's edge with the loom of their deltas. People, black and beautiful as the night. The bare pointed breast of women in the marketplaces. The rippling muscles of men loading palm oil and cocoa beans and mahogany on ships from the white man's world. For that was why our ship was there, to carry away the treasures of Africa. We brought machinery and tools, canned goods, and Hollywood films. We took away riches out of the earth loaded by human hands. We paid very little for the labor. We paid but a little more for the things we took away. The white man dominates Africa. He takes produce and lives very much as he chooses. The yield of the earth for Europe and America. The yield of men for Europe's colonial armies. The Africans are baffled and humble. They listen to the missionaries and bow down before the Lord. But they bow much lower for the traders who carry whips and guns and are protected by white laws made in Europe for the black colonies. At that time, 1923, the name of Marcus Garvey was known the length and breadth of the west coast of Africa, and the Africans did not laugh at Marcus Garvey, as so many people laughed in New York. They hoped what they had heard about him was true, that he really would unify the black world and free and exalt Africa. They did not understand the terrific complications of the colonial problem. They only knew the white man was there in Africa, heavy and oppressive on their backs, and they wanted him to go away. Our problems in America are much like yours, I told the Africans, especially in the South. I am a Negro too. But they only laughed at me and shook their heads and said, "You white man, you white man." It was the only place in the world where I have ever been called a white man. They looked at my copper brown skin and straight black hair, like my grandmother's Indian hair except a little curly, and they said, "You white man." One of the crew men from Liberia, crew KRU, from Liberia, working on our ship, who had seen many American Negroes of various shades and color and knew much of America, explained to me. "Here," he said, "on the West Coast, there are not many colored people, people of mixed blood, and those foreign colored men who are here come mostly as missionaries to teach us something since they think we know nothing. Or they come from the West Indies as clerks and administrators in the colonial governments to help carry out the white man's laws. So Africans call them all white men." "But I am not white," I said. "You are not black either," the crewman said. Simply, "There is a man of my color," and he pointed to George, the pantryman, who protested loudly. "Don't point at me," George said. "I'm from Lexington, Kentucky, USA, and no African blood nowhere." "You black," said the crewman. "I can part my hair," said George, "and it ain't nappy." But to tell the truth, George shaved a part in his hair every other week since the comb wouldn't work. The crewman knew this, so they both laughed loudly, for George's face was as African as Africa. Yet, dark as he was, George always referred to himself as brown-skinned, and it was not until years later when a dark-skinned minister in New Jersey denounced me to his congregation for using the word black to describe him in a newspaper article, I realized that most dark Negroes in America do not like the word black at all. They prefer to be referred to as brown-skinned, or at the most as dark brown skin, no matter how dark they really are. In one of the smaller African ports, I came across a peculiarly poignant tragedy of mixed blood. Now this part of the story, it starts to wind down. It doesn't seem very interesting until the very end, where he's talking about a mixed blood person in Africa. And I'm talking about half white and half black. And actually, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to skip down here. Edward's father was an Englishman, I learned, who had been in charge of the bank at this far-flung post of the British Empire. He had lived inside a kind of compound where the bank and the various government officials' homes were located. 4 years ago, Edward had lived inside that compound too for a while with his mother, the house servant. But his father had retired and gone back to England, and now Edward and his mother lived outside the compound. His father had left a small allowance for them, and occasionally he wrote them a letter from London, but he would not permit the boy or his mother to come to England. Edward said that it was very lonely for them there. The whites inside the compound naturally would have nothing to do with him, nor would they give him a job, and the Negroes did not like his mother because she had lived for years with a white man. So Edward had no friends in the village and almost nobody to talk to. Was our boat going to England? Could we take him away with us? Was it true that in America the black people were friendly to the mulatto people, but the white people were bad to them all? Were the white people generally bad to colored people everywhere? Edward said his own father was not bad, but now his father had gone away to England and left him there alone with his mother. What could he do? Poor kid, he looked very lonely as he stood on the dock the day our ship hauled anchor. He had taken my address to write me in America, and once, a year later, I had a letter from him, but only one, because I have a way of not answering letters when I don't know what to say. So it's a pretty sad story, but in this chapter about when he got to Africa, you can see Langston Hughes talking about white men in Africa. You see the tone of the book changes right here, because as we go further into the book, Langston Hughes' form of writing becomes more militant, and he talks about Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement, and he talks about how Africa's viewed Marcus Garvey compared to how they viewed him in New York. He said they didn't laugh at him in Africa like they did in New York. And so on my next page, I'll do a little bit of research on Marcus Garvey. What I know about Marcus Garvey is what I learned from Malcolm X as a follower of Marcus Garvey, and what other people have said about Marcus Garvey. I've read a few articles a few years ago that Marcus Garvey wrote, but I'm not really fluent in what his Back to Africa movement entailed. I found it very curious that he was being led around by a man from Liberia, because from what I understand, the slaves in the U.S. did return to Africa and establish the country of Liberia. And I would like to do some studying about Liberia. If any of you watching this page have some suggestions of books that I can read about Liberia, because from what I know about Liberia, I heard from a Liberian woman that I know from here in Portland, and she told me that she was a descendant of some of the slaves that went to Liberia and established the country there. And she told me that once the slaves arrived in Liberia, they began to oppress the native Liberians there. You know, as they were oppressed in the U.S., they must have picked up some of the cruelty and malice that they learned in the U.S. and started to oppress the natives that were already in Liberia when they went to establish the country there, and took their wealth. And then the natives in Liberia were living very poor and not getting along with the blacks that had arrived from America. But I'm not well versed in that either, and I don't know exactly where to look to find that type of information. I would love to read some narratives of natives from Liberia that talk about that, but that's a very interesting topic to see how the slaves that established Liberia treated the people there. But this Liberian, you know, he was telling Langston Hughes why he was viewed as a white man in Africa. And I had experience with an African woman that I knew in Ohio. She was from Cameroon, and she told me that they viewed all mixed people and all lighter skinned people as white men because they just don't trust them. They said she said if you're not real dark skinned, they don't trust you. And she wasn't very dark skinned, but she was from Cameroon and she was from there, so and she spoke the language and she lived there, but she said they just don't trust lighter skinned people, so they refer to them as white. But that's the thing, like you can't bring your values, your ways of living, your beliefs, and go to another country and think that they follow you. Like an African coming to the US, I've met Africans that come to the US and automatically start assuming some people are white and some people are not, and they're just way off the mark, and they end up offending all kind of people. So then you get a whole bunch of black people in the US that don't like Africans. You get a lot of Africans that don't like black Americans. And then you got people like Langston Hughes who go to Africa, try to explain to people that he's not white, but they don't accept him. He is white. In their eyes, he's white. You're in a different culture. They don't have the same discourse as they have in the US. Their history is different. And we're going to get into that when we get into the slave trade, because that's a big topic on everyone's agenda lately, is this thing about slavery and slaves being captured, slaves being sold, who originated the slave trade, who's to be held accountable. We talk about reparations, and I mentioned on a few other videos of mine that I have been doing piecemeal research on this, and my reality of the slave trade from what I've been reading has been altered, because I'm like the majority of people. I saw roots and I saw them capture slaves, so I believed that the majority of slaves were captured by Europeans. But from what I'm reading now, it seems to me that the majority of slaves were sold by African kings. Europeans successfully implemented the divide and conquer, had Africans fighting among each other in order to procure slaves, in order to buy arms, to become powerful, war after war after war with neighboring tribes until they were weakened and eventually colonized with no resistance by the European powers because of their greed. And when I do present my pages on that, I will definitely give you the resources so you can look at it yourself, because the most of the information that I'm getting about the slave trade is from religious Europeans protesting the slave trade and speaking ill of the slave trade, wanting the slave trade to end. So I believe that they're being honest when they're criticizing what's going on in Africa. Some of the documents that I've read are just straight business documents about trading slaves with the kings in Africa by the thousands. By the thousands. And of course, I do have some documentation of priests and religious men who wanted to discontinue in the slave trade because of the pillaging and the raping and all of that. Speaking of that, in the turn of the tone of Langston Hughes' story or his autobiography, he talks about a rape that he witnessed while on his ship. And this is a point, see, Langston Hughes is honest, and he was criticized much by the black community for his honesty because back in the day, W.B. Du Bois, Alan Locke, or Du Bois, however you want to pronounce it, Alan Locke, all of them wanted to put forth the good Negro. They put forth a false picture to make it seem like all Negroes, all black people were intellectuals, all interested in education. They didn't want to show any of the dirt. However, Langston Hughes was just honest. So he talks about what went on his ship, the SS Malone. Now, when they went to Africa, when they docked after traveling the ocean for many months with just men, they get to Africa, and like most men do, they were interested in the women. Women were not allowed on board. However, two African girls decided that they wanted to go on the boat. And they made it to the boat. And they were raped. And Langston Hughes witnesses it and talks about it. And here's what he says. Okay, no women were permitted on the boat. And often we anchored 2 or 3 miles offshore when the surf was high and the harbor shallow. In such cases, the captain would issue no money. And even if he had issued money, there was no safe way of getting ashore unless one paid a boatman extra to carry you on his shoulders through the rolling surf, which was deep and dangerous and often overturned the rowboats. Once we were anchored for more than a week, away out in the water, too far to see clearly the port from which our cargo came. We had no money, even to buy fruit from the bumboats that occasionally drifted out. But one night, very late, 2 little African girls rowed through the surf in a boat to our vessel, all alone, and stole aboard past the night watchman, hoping to make some money. No doubt the seaman on watch helped them aboard, because someone brought them straight back to the sailors' quarters. The sailors woke up excited and jubilant and went around knocking on everybody's doors, calling, "Women aboard, women aboard." Firemen, mess boys, cooks, the bosun, chips, the oilers poured forth from their respective sleeping places. The bosun, boss-like, grabbed one of the girls and took her off privately to his cabin. Someone threw the other girl down on the floor on a blanket in the middle of the sailors' quarters and stripped her of her flowered cloth. She lay there naked and held up her hands. The girl said, "Money, money," but nobody had any money. 30 men crowded around, mostly in their underwear, sat up on bunks to watch, smoked, yelled, and joked, and waited for their turn. Each time a man would rise, the little African girl on the floor would say, "Money, money," but nobody had a cent, yet they wouldn't let her get up. Finally, I couldn't bear to hear her crying, "Money," anymore, so I went to bed. But the festival went on all night. Once before, I had seen the men from our ship take advantage of the people ashore, although in a different way. And then he goes on to tell about how the sailors cheated some Africans out of money. But that's a very hard excerpt to read that he put in his autobiography. And yeah, 30 men. None of them have any money, but they were all on this African girl. So that's what went on these ships when they traveled overseas. And Langston Hughes, he flat out, he tells what ship he's on. He tells the time period. What was it, 1923? Because he was talking about Marcus Garvey. And his description of the captain of that ship. is the same as a description of a sailor in the book The Ways of White Folks in a story called Red-Headed Baby. He talks about a red-headed alcoholic sailor who comes ashore, goes down, comes to America. He's American, but he's a sailor, and he's back in America, and he's visiting a prostitute that he frequented whenever he visited the U.S. or whenever he docked, and then he found out that she had had a red-headed baby. So the description of the captain of this SS Malone is a drunk, red-headed captain who stays drunk. And so again, there's these captains and people that are popping up in his autobiography are the people that were in the Ways of White Folks. But he said that everybody liked the captain. He was very friendly. So even though he neglected a lot of his work, he never got fired. But so Langston Hughes, he's just telling it like it is. He didn't participate in the rape from what he says, but he couldn't do anything to stop it because men go crazy if they haven't been around women for so long. And these prostitutes went on that ship alone, helpless, and that's what happened to them. So the Big C, I'm on a chapter called The Sailor's Holiday. The next one is, he talks about some missionaries, and he talks about the guy from Liberia. And then when we get back, so I'm going to read the next few chapters, Barutu Moon, and we're steadily moving towards when he comes home, and then he travels to Harlem, Paris, and he starts to talk about the Harlem Renaissance, which is, once he starts in on the Harlem Renaissance, that's the rest of his book. He gets very militant in his views about liberal white folks and what was going on during that time period. That's the gem of this book, which makes this autobiography the standard and the most truthful, the best resource to learn about the Harlem Renaissance. Those who participated in it, Langston Hughes seems like he knows everyone that was writing a book or doing some type of art during that period. And we're going to look at the Fire, the magazine that he and his crew called the Niggerati put together. And maybe, with the help of some of my subscribers and people who are viewing this page, maybe we can recreate that magazine. They funded it themselves, and it was about the average man, average black man, average black woman doing what they do in everyday life. And it was frowned upon by many of the intellectuals, but Langston Hughes and those who were writing it, they didn't care because it was truthful. They talk about colorism. They talked about what was going on in the speakeasies. They talked about mixing and mingling with white women in Paris. They talked about mixing and mingling with white Jews. They talked about homosexuality. And then there's some drawings in it, and there's some poetry written by Langston Hughes that we'll read. And when we get into Fire, we're going to get into that. And it was called Fire because anything that is engulfed by flames transforms and turns into something totally different. So that's why they called it Fire. But we'll get into that when we get there, when he talks about it. And we're going to continue with some excerpts and things of Zora Neale Hurston, because we did a YouTube page about her and it got a lot of views, so many people are interested in her, and she's in this book. And we're going to get into Wallace Thurman. He has some interesting books that I want to get into, called The Infants of the Spring and Blacker the Berry. Books that talking about colorism and the goings-ons and during the Harlem Renaissance, and has a lot of conversations going on that you won't see in the majority of books or anything in the 1930s, 1920s, and the 1930s. So we're going to continue with the Big C, Black literature, Black history. This is Jason Williams. Have a nice evening.